This is Ty Newell, and this is a demonstration and a tour of the COVID Safe Space Calculator. So I've opened up the worksheets with the COVID Safe Space IAQ calculator, and there's no reason to see me, so I'm going to disappear, and then we'll take a tour through the different aspects of the calculator. Um, as we look at the calculator, there's a series of worksheets. And we're going to spend most of our time on this COVID Safe Space worksheet, but let's begin with a bit of a tour. As in most cases, there's a README. We won't bother looking at that, but take a look at that as well as follow along with our other instructional videos and written information. There's the COVID Safe Space calculator where we'll spend most of our time, and the inputs that go into making a COVID safe space also are the ones that you should be following in any case to create a healthy space. And this second worksheet, the indoor air quality and cognition worksheet, this has a few more inputs, and its purpose is to help you understand the value of creating a COVID safe space. And on the COVID safe space worksheet right now, the input levels are such that they're very good, that people are likely to be satisfied with the air, unlike a typical space where more than 20% of the people in that space are not satisfied. Sick days are estimated to be about half that of what standard ventilation would be, and there's value in that. And then your brain's going to function better. These different areas of cognition performance, that these are likely to be improved as much as by 10% with running ventilation systems where we should be running them. And this has value too. So this is carried along to also let you see that what we're doing for COVID, we should be doing in any case because it's going to improve your performance. It's going to reduce the days you're sick each year. And it's also going to increase your satisfaction with air quality in indoor spaces. Now, as we're going to be telling people, we really need to increase ventilation. And here's how much value that has as far as your performance, your reduced sick days. And here's how it gets rid of COVID by reducing the transmission of the disease, by reducing the probability that you're going to catch the disease. Others are going to say, well, you can't have that much ventilation. It's too much. It's going to cost an arm and a leg for utility bills. It's energy inefficient, and we must save energy. And this sheet's purpose on energy and costs is meant to give you some information to help explain why improving human value is so much more important than saving energy. And in many cases, what you're going to find is that the expenditure in energy is quite small. But this worksheet gives you the tools for doing that. And its emphasis, its basic view, is on the cost for, say, enhanced ventilation per hour per person so that we can compare what, for example, doubling fresh air ventilation means as far as the utility cost in a harsh winter climate, in a harsh, hot, humid climate, relative to human performance and human value. So where the average wage in the US might be $25 an hour, what this sheet is going to tell you, when you double the ventilation level from what's currently standard to get to a space where COVID is going to die out and where you're going to perform much better than you do under standard conditions, that cost to the facilities, to the maintenance budget, that's only going to be about 1 to 2 pennies per hour per person in relation to somebody that might be earning a poverty level $15 per hour wage or a more average $25 per hour wage. So this is meant to bridge that gap between the costs needed to improve a space and how that space improves the human, and putting, of course, dollar and cents with it. Some background information, a lot of live links you can click on. These will take you to various reports and papers that are the background for this calculator. These factors, these relations aren't just grabbed out of thin air. There's real science, there's real experimental data, there's real knowledge behind these, and this calculator represents a grouping and integration of this knowledge in order to look at how the building operates and how your health and performance and the ability to defeat COVID are all combined. Now, for convenience, here's some weather data that you can use with the energy and cost sheet. And basically, looking at January and July are the months that you would focus on for looking at the extreme summer conditions and winter conditions. But you can get your own weather data wherever you'd like, or just poke in some numbers for fun to see how it impacts energy and costs. Some additional information on carbon dioxide, but I recommend you review the video on carbon dioxide to get more background in its importance for telling you that a building is being operated properly, for telling you that a building has a sufficient amount of fresh air to keep you healthy and functioning well as avoiding catching any disease. A bit about me, but this is not about me. It's about you. So let's go back to the COVID Safe Space worksheet and talk about how it operates. Now, I've got some numbers in here, and I'm going to change these. For example, a more typical value within an indoor space is about 1,200 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Outdoor level of carbon dioxide, unfortunately, is now 400 parts per million. When I was born back in 1952, it was 300, and it's likely to increase to about 600 in just a few more decades. And and we can take account of that because as you use this tool, you want to think about preparing buildings of the future or buildings now that will last 3 decades, 5 decades, or more from now. And looking at as the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere grows from 400 to 600 to 800, what that means as far as what you need for ventilation to keep people productive and to also have a pandemic safe building beyond COVID. So 1200 is where current ventilation practices would take you. And as you study our other background videos, you'll see that most buildings, even though they may be designed for about this level of carbon dioxide, that only a fraction of them actually operate at this level. And what I'll be telling you is to double that number, and we'll see why. So let's put in an infectious person, and let's say that nobody's been vaccinated or recovered yet, and maybe this is like an office space environment with 11 people. And so we're not going to have anyone vaccinated, but we populate this building with a number of people, some people who are susceptible, someone who's immune, perhaps by catching COVID and fortunately recovering and now have a level of immunity. And then others who have been vaccinated and have a level of immunity, level of protection. And then an infectious person is among you, whether they know they have the disease or not, but they're in that space. And you're going to share it for, say, an 8-hour workday. And let's say no one is wearing any masks. And I'm going to put the mask efficiency, so if people were wearing them, similar to a level that you might attain with today's cloth masks and poorly fitting cloth masks, bandanas and stuff of that nature. So about 20%. But at this point, nobody's wearing them. Nobody believes they work for whatever reason. Now, on the metabolism level, we'll leave it at 1.5, which is typical for office work. And on the input side of the COVID Safe Space worksheet, you can see that there's explanatory notes. So for example, on metabolism, a metabolism of 1 basically means you're sitting quietly in a chair, maybe reading a book. And then office work activity, getting up, getting down periodically, moving around a bit, that has a value maybe 1.2 to 1.7 METs, metabolic units. Sleeping about 0.7 METs, vigorous physical exertion and exercise maybe as much as 7 to 10 mets. So your metabolic rate can change by a factor of 10. And associated with the metabolic rate is your breathing, and your breathing impacts how much carbon dioxide you're putting out. And carbon dioxide, when you follow the carbon dioxide video, is important because also associated with your breathing is the contagion, the virus that you're exhaling. And so the more you breathe, the more carbon dioxide, and correlating with carbon dioxide is the amount of virus you're putting out. So if you're in a gym that has, say, a metabolic rate among the people in the gym of maybe 5 or 6 because of physical exertion, this number should be 5 or 6. And in order to maintain a certain level of carbon dioxide, the amount of fresh air that's brought in has to increase. And so the left-hand side takes account of all these interactions among people. We'll leave it at 1.5 and take a look at that. And then say a more typical rate of what's circulated through a filter might be about 20 cubic feet per minute per person in the building. And the more typical filter has been a MERV 8, a filter designed to protect the heat exchanger coils in the air conditioning system and the furnace system rather than protecting the people inside the building. And then there's a second filtration system, and I'll change its filter back to MERV 8. And I'll leave these advanced settings alone, and we'll come back to those later. But what I've done here on the inputs for 11 people in the building, they're in the building for 480 minutes or an 8-hour day. They have 1,200 parts per million of carbon dioxide, typical of today's standard ventilation. And they're not wearing masks. The filtration is typical, and this is a schematic of it. Now, you might ask, why are there two filtration systems? And that's to give you the flexibility to assume that there's, say, a central filtration system for the building, say in a school or in a restaurant. But beyond what the central system is capable of doing, that you decide to also add maybe a space filtration system, one that you can buy in any big box store, maybe a couple $100, and it might have, say, 400 cubic feet per minute of airflow with a MERV 13 filter. And if it had 400 cubic feet per minute capability, and you have 10 to 11 people in it, then you could say that that might have 40 cubic feet per minute of airflow through a MERV 13 filter added to that room's virus catching capability. But let's put this back to where it's an ineffective filtration system. A MERV 8 does not capture any virus, and our video on filters discusses that in more detail. So here's our standard building, about 1,200 parts per million of carbon dioxide, and by specifying the carbon dioxide and the metabolic rate, that tells us directly that we're putting 20 cubic feet per minute of fresh air per person into that building. And with 11 people, that's about 220 cubic feet of fresh air. Not a very large amount, but about 220 cubic feet of fresh air into that space. Now, of those 11 people, we've specified one is infectious, so about 10% of the office space has infectious person, and the other 90% are not immune from the disease or all susceptible. And with these settings, then, we find that down here, what we really want to get to is understanding the chance that you'll get infected if there's an infectious person in the building, and the ability of that infectious person to spread the disease. And that is really the goal, is to look at this, what I call the infection multiplier, get that number below 1. The infection multiplier, the ratio of the number of people that infectious person is likely to infect during that time period. When that is below 1, that infectious person is no longer able to recreate, to sustain the transmission of that disease. When it's above 1, here when it's 7, That's implying that this building environment, an infectious person is likely to infect 7 people. Those 7 people go home to stores and other places and infect perhaps 7 more if those spaces are run like this one, who infect 7 more, and you have the exponential growth you've heard about. So let's go over here and see how to create a COVID safe space. As I mentioned, these explanatory notes tell you a bit, but the short videos, the YouTube videos on, say, carbon dioxide and on filters give you more background. If I change the carbon dioxide level in that space to 800, it's easily measured, it's conveniently measured, and it's inexpensive to measure. And so if I have a monitor that tells me I've put in enough fresh air for the number of people in that space that it'll be held at 800 parts per million, that change of increased fresh air, which dilutes contagion, is going to double from 20 cubic feet per minute per person to 40 cubic feet per minute per person, the fresh air flow rate. Now, that will raise some flags with people watching utility bills, but as I mentioned, in other videos where we'll explain the cost and the energy impacts of changing ventilation, we're talking about 1 to 2 pennies per hour per person for enhanced ventilation in harsh winter climates and harsh hot humid climates. Okay? So the cost relative to paying somebody a low wage of $10 to $15 per hour or a more typical wage of $25 per hour, a penny or two per hour per person is well worth it to also make that person more satisfied with the air quality, have fewer sick days because of improved air quality, and to also have them function better, that their cognition, their brain performs better, makes better decisions, works more efficiently at getting tasks done. So, in going from 1,200 parts per million to 800, that implies that we've doubled the fresh air from 20 cubic feet per minute to 40. And the impact of that change has been to reduce the chance you'll get infected from over 70% to less than 50%, to about a coin toss level. Heads or tails, you're going to get sick or you're not over this 8-hour day. And more importantly, it's reduced the infection multiplier. So where it looked like maybe 7 people or more would get infected by an infectious person, now that infectious person with this additional fresh air is going to be likely to infect less than 5 people. Now, exposure time is very important. Let's say one of our options is to only have people share this space for 4 hours a day instead of 8. When we do that and we come over, we haven't changed the amount of ventilation needed. We still have the same number of people. And to maintain 800 parts per million relative to their respiration rate, their metabolic rate, we still need 40 cubic feet per minute per person. But now we've almost cut in half the probability somebody's going to get sick by lowering their exposure time. So in a restaurant, a customer who's there for an hour or two has a different exposure risk than, say, the staff who are there for a 6 or 8 hour shift. And furthermore, we've lowered, but still not lowered enough, the infection multiplier. Now only 2 to 3 people are likely to get infected by the infectious person rather than more than 7. But let's say that we really need to have people in this workspace, in this shared space for 8 hours of the day. And so we're still at unacceptable levels here. We're not going to vaccinate anyone yet. We're not going to require that masks are worn yet. But let's go down here and change that filter in the central system um, from a MERV 8 to a MERV 13 filter. And a MERV 13 filter will capture about 90% of the virus. A MERV 8 is like you have no filter in there at all as far as capturing virus. By adding 20 cubic feet per minute of recirculated air through a MERV 13 filter. We're pulling out virus and we're further reducing the probability that you're going to get infected. And we've reduced the number of people an infectious person might infect. If we double the amount of airflow through this filter, we have further progress toward reducing the probability of getting infected and the number of people infected. And if you bring in a space filter to your office, to your classroom, that has, say, at least a MERV 11 and MERV 13, MERV 16 filter, with 40 cubic feet per minute per person through a space filter, we have an additional drop. And even though adding airflow to the main system and to this one, you have decreasing return on how much the infection probability drops, it's still recommended to have this space filter, at least right now, while the virus is detectable in our communities, because it adds redundancy. So if somebody happens to not put in a MERV 13 filter here, I haven't seen a significant drop in or a significant change of the infection probability and infection multiplier because I still have this one pulling out a substantial amount of virus. Now, let's go back up here and still not vaccinate or have immune people in the space. We're still not an acceptable level. We need to at least cut this infection multiplier in half and hopefully further reduce the infection probability. So let's do that by wearing a mask. Let's have 50% of the people wearing a mask, but they're like a typical cloth mask. And if you look at our video on masks, you'll find that the cloth masks that people make, because of the poor fit in many of them, from like a bandana to other loose fitting masks, as well as the quality of the filtration of the mask, that it is maybe in the range of 10-20%. Now it does add improvement over here, but if I get a better fitting mask that's say 50% efficient in both inhalation and exhalation, and some masks, if they're poorly fitting, when you breathe out, the filtration effectiveness, the leakage of the mask can be different than when you're inhaling. And that's why there's two levels of here. Also, you may have seen the mask where there's a small valve, a check valve, that when you exhale, it lets the breath come out more easily, and when you inhale, it closes to protect you. That mask would have a very low exhalation efficiency, and that is a very poor thing to wear. And so I definitely recommend you do not wear these masks with the exhalation valve. Get rid of those. That means you're not protecting others. If you're the infectious person, you're spewing out every bit as much contagion as you would be without wearing a mask. You're not protecting others properly. So wear a mask that's exhalation efficient and inhalation efficient. So if we move that up to 50%, we've made even further progress here. And this 50% mask usage, you can interpret that as, say, 100% of people wearing a mask 50% of the time, perhaps in a restaurant where you need to remove a mask to eat and then replace the mask when you're not eating. Or people are wearing masks only 50% of the people are wearing masks. They're wearing them 100% of the time, but there's another 50% of the people indoors not wearing any masks. So those are the same case from the viewpoint of mask usage. So let's go to a better mask. And from our video on masks, and masks definitely work. They definitely filter out virus. There's no questions, and that information is provided in that video. And you can definitely buy a mask for $1 to $2, like a KN95, similar to the performance of the gold standard, the N95, but not having the certification and then being more widely available. We need those critical N95 masks to go to our frontline medical personnel, to go to our essential workers. But the KN95 still has this very, very high performance and this very, very good fit on your face. And so with a 90% efficient mask, with 50% usage, you can see that we've gotten to this level where our infection probability is below 10%. So if you're susceptible, you're not likely, you're much less likely, a tenth as likely as you were under standard conditions without mask protection to get infected. And then more importantly, we've hit herd immunity. We've hit an infection multiplier of 1. And the further we go below 1, the more resilient this space is to virus variants, the more resilient this space is as you have more or less people added to the space or you spend more or less time in it, and the faster the disease dies out in your community. The smaller this number is, the faster the disease dies out. Now let's get to 100% mass usage with good fitting, good filtration efficiency masks. Now this thing is going to go away. It's not going to keep making people sick. Let's compare this, because you've heard the confusion, you've heard the controversy about masks and that vaccines are more important than masks. And as I just showed, with 100% mass usage and highly efficient masks, we drop the infection multiplier down to where that one infectious person is perhaps infecting only 0.02 people. Now, how do you infect 0.02 people? Well, what it really means is collectively across all indoor spaces of this type, that let's say if there's 100 of them, that now 2 people in those 100 buildings with 11 people per building, only 2 people are going to catch the disease from the 100 infectious people that are placed in each of those 100 buildings. And that means the disease is going to die out of your community, it's going to die out of your region and out of your country. Okay. Now we only have a 0.2% chance of getting infected. If I'm susceptible, as everyone is in this case, I only have 0.2% chance of catching it by wearing the mask to catch contagion if I'm infectious, to protect me from contagious, from getting infected if I'm susceptible. So let's not wear any masks. And of course, we'd all like to get back to that. And over here, let's start vaccinating people. Let's say there's 9 people now who are susceptible because one person's gotten vaccinated. And we could put one immune person who's recovered. This is really the least desirable and the most cost expensive path to follow, is this so-called herd immunity by acquired infection. We don't want that. It's extremely expensive and costly, as well as just horrendous with the number of people who would die by following that path. The vaccination path is the cost-effective path. As we went from 10 susceptible to 9 with one person who's protected by vaccination, we've dropped the infection multiplier, but an interesting thing happens with the probability of getting infected. If you're one of that group of 9 that's still susceptible and an infectious person walks into that space, you're just as likely to get infected, about 20% chance of you becoming infected during that 8-hour period, as you were when everybody was susceptible. Now let's say there's only 7 people susceptible, and now we have 3 people that have been vaccinated. Again, I've dropped the infection multiplier. I'm getting toward herd immunity as vaccination level increases. But if I'm still one of the unvaccinated, one of the susceptible people, I'm still at 20% likelihood of getting sick if an infectious person walks in. Herd immunity does not mean if you have not gotten vaccinated that your infection probability has been changed. You're every bit as susceptible to an infectious person in your space as you were when everybody was susceptible. So I knock this down some more. Let's say now I'm where half the people are vaccinated. Now, again, I'm getting closer to where I'm getting below an, an infection multiplier of 1, the limit where I cross into herd immunity, but any of the susceptibles left, still a 20% chance of getting infected by this infectious person. I get down to 3, where now 70% of that indoor space have 90% protection through the vaccine. And look what happens. I've hit herd immunity. Somewhere between 50% and 70%, just as you've been hearing on the news, when we hit that level of vaccination, we've hit herd immunity. And so as I reach that level of 3 people, whoop, I put in 70 people. Let me change that back to 7. So as I go from 3 people to 7, from with only 3 people susceptible and 7 people protected, I've crossed that threshold when I was at 5 people or 50% susceptible and 50% immune. I was above 1. I dropped to 30% susceptible and 70% immune. I've crossed that threshold. Oop, keep putting in a 70 instead of a 7. So you'll see perhaps some mistakes you're likely to make. And, um, and so in going from 50% to 70% protection level with a vaccine, I've crossed a threshold where I have herd immunity. But again, these remaining 3 people are still at a 20% probability of getting infected. Herd immunity has not changed their risk of getting infected. And let me just drop this down to 1 person. And now I have 9 people who are protected. I continue to drop this infection multiplier, and the lower it goes, the faster the disease decays out of your community, out of your region. But for those who either for medical reasons are unable to get vaccinated or just obstinate or reluctant, their risk of getting sick is exactly the same as it was, whether everyone else in the space is susceptible or everyone else is protected. Herd immunity does not change that susceptible person's probability of infection. Now let's look at a couple other factors why we want to get this as low as possible, and that's variance. And as you look at our YouTube video on variants, we'll discuss this in more detail as well. But there's 2 paths that the virus is taking. And as nature has designed everything, that everything tries to survive, a virus as well. It tries to create ways that it can be transmitted more efficiently. It tries to create ways that a vaccine is no longer uh, protective, that it no longer triggers your immune system to recognize that virus. And so these 2 pathways, for example, the UK variant from the United Kingdom seems to be transmitting more efficiently while not impacting the efficacy of the vaccine. Whereas the South African variant, and there's many, many other variants, this is happening all around the world, so not to just point out those 2. But the South African variant seems to transmit about the same as the original version of the virus, but with more protection with a lowered efficacy of various vaccines. So by getting to this level of protection, by increasing our number of people vaccinated, if that vaccine is now only 50% efficient, you can see that, well, that was enough to launch us back into where this disease is going to start growing again. Okay. Let's put this back to 90% protective. Let's go down here to infectiousness. An infectious dose we call a quanta, and that's in some rough manner, maybe an amount of virus that's shed from somebody. But from one disease to another, and from one variant of the virus to another, that may not be more virus. It may just be virus that's just more efficient at getting into your body from someone else. And so a quanta is just an infectious dose, whether that's a lot of virus or not much. And for this particular disease and virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, it appears as if we that we uh, have about 100 quanta per hour that's shed by a person. And if we change that to, say, 200 quanta per hour down in this advanced setting, we see that with all of these other things we've done to improve ventilation airflow, to vaccinate people, and to improve filtration of air within the space, that's given us protection. So if a variant comes through that's twice as transmissible, that we're still at a place where we can keep this thing from growing. So let's put this back at 100. Now, as long as virus is detectable, we should be wearing masks, and everybody should be wearing masks, so that we can reach this state where, look over here, it's just not going to multiply at all. We kill it off. There's some decimals over here that you don't see, but we can get rid of this virus. But if we now only have a vaccine effectiveness, efficacy of 50%, you can see this starts growing. If virus changes shape before we can create a new vaccine to treat that new shape, and it's now only 25% effective or 10% effective, that this chance of getting the disease is growing, and it's growing rapidly. And if people start relaxing and not wearing masks, we're back up here where we get this exponential growth. So as long as the disease is detectable, we want to hold these conditions, and we want to be serious about wearing face masks. And if the disease is also more transmissible, as well as the vaccine dropping in efficacy, we see that this impacts this. And as we drop to lower levels of mask efficiency, you can see by going to a lower quality mask or wearing a poor fitting, poor filtering mask, even though everyone's supposedly wearing a mask, now we're back in accelerated disease transmission. So all of these factors are going to impact how we can keep the disease at bay. It will also impact the air quality and the energy costs, but those are discussions for another day. But these are the basic steps that you follow through to create a COVID safe space. Drop the carbon dioxide level, which drops the level of contagion by adding more fresh air. Get people vaccinated. More people unvaccinated means that we're also in an accelerating disease environment. Fewer people wearing low efficiency masks further accelerates the progress of the disease. Using ineffective filters in air filtration units further increases the spread of the disease. And and then again, operating buildings with standard ventilation. Lots of people are going to get sick. Your chance of getting infected, if you're susceptible, increases to uh, more than a 50-50 chance. You're going to get sick, if not today, the next day with that infectious person. Thank you. Again, contact me, Ty Newell, at tynewell@illinois.edu for any questions, comments, and criticisms.